right, folks, welcome into another special coronavirus episode of I've Got a Theory. Got my guest here, Ajay Gupta, who's a highly reputable, well-known attorney here in San Diego. He's also my attorney and friend, but we're not going to talk about law. We are going to talk about economics. So, Ajay, thank you for joining me today. What's your theory?
Wow, I didn't realize we're going to jump right into it. I am an armchair economist, so that means that I get to throw rocks at people without being responsible for what the outcomes are. So the question is why do bubbles exist, and are they in fact preventable, or do people even want them to be prevented?
Okay.
So we're going to talk about bubbles today. So
yeah. So is there an angle to a theory? Is there a way? Because I would argue that potentially that these things are manipulated based on information asymmetry.
There's a lot nested in that statement, right? I don't think it's necessarily that. So money has to go somewhere, right? Like that's
Okay.
generally the case. So you can actually say like when the government makes decisions, and maybe this is what you mean when you say manipulation. The government makes decisions. They say, okay, look, we want to make an investment in college tuition, right? And in the 80s, they made college debt non-dischargeable. And so therefore, what you saw was that a lot of people issued loans for college tuition. A lot of banks that would normally not lend on college tuition would now lend to students because now it was non-dischargeable in bankruptcy. And the net effect was to push more money into that particular industry, which drove college tuition,
Okay.
right? So tuitions have gone up four or five-fold since 1980. I mean, it's incredible, with the exception of maybe college tuitions that are subsidized by the state. But I mean,
it's going up 16% a year is on average, 16% a year. So almost every 4.5 years, tuition doubles.
Right. And so that's an example of where you create money in a particular, and that's a little bit different than what I would call a traditional economic bubble, but it is an example of maybe what you're talking about, which is where, there's different policies in place that create maybe bubbles would be the wrong terms, but industry growth. You could say the same thing about healthcare, right? Healthcare, to an extent, there are policies in place designed to promote and build hospitals. Any hospital any building, I would say at least 20 to 30% of buildings in San Diego County are medical facilities.
That sounds right.
I mean, like every time
pharmaceutical,
Kaiser, UCSD, every time I see a nice big glass building, it's either going to be a high-rise downtown, or it's going to be a big, huge medical facility.
Or if it's a beat-up old building, it's probably a methadone clinic.
Well, I know a little bit less about that than
you. I just worked next to one, so I know.
Right. Okay. So
I've been Googling bubbles, and what you're indicating is a new paradigm, right? There's some kind of impetus that says, hey, we've got low interest rates, or it's a new technology, or it's a new opportunity. Let's put some stuff into it.
A traditional bubble, as I see it, is the most common sectors that you see bubbles in are going to be the stock market and the housing market.
Housing, yep.
Right? Those are where you traditionally see them. They exist in other places as well, but that's where you see them. And like the common wisdom for a bubble is as follows, right? Like the idea is it's related to a traditional. I don't have the benefit of having all the stuff here, but like if you think about your demand curves in an economic scale. I'm not trying to get too dense here, so we'll just make this. If the price of bananas goes up, then the demand for bananas goes down, right?
True.
Like that's a traditional demand curve. Is there's an inverse relationship between price and demand because they can usually substitute to a different good or something of that nature. My econ professor, he was actually my contracts professor. He said the world makes more sense if you have a fundamental understanding of economics. But anyway, but if you think about it, because of the wealth effect, right? And you see this in the housing market all the time. Because of the wealth effect, what happens is when somebody house price goes up, they're able to take the money out of that house and reinvest in more housing, right? So if I'm an investor and I've got 3 properties and those properties all go up by 15%, I can take that and use that as a down payment and buy more properties. And the same thing happens in the stock market. People go out on margin, their stocks go up, they go out on margin more, and they go buy more stocks. So as a result, the demand curve on a traditional in these industries is flipped over, and that is when price goes up, then the value goes up, right? The demand for it actually increases as opposed to decreases. So it actually runs parallel to the supply curve.
So you think it's like housing is more of a luxury good, where more expensive stuff has higher demand?
No, I think that as price goes up, the supply increases, and as the price goes up, the demand increases.
Okay.
That's very, very unusual for any other industry.
Yeah.
Normally, as price goes up, the supply is going to increase. Of course it is, right? If banana charge people, if people are paying $20 for a banana, then guess what? We're going to see more bananas everywhere, right?
There's going to be banana farms popping up.
Right, exactly. And that's the way the market's designed to work. But when you're talking about things that in these industries where bubbles traditionally happen, right? There's one of two things that are going on. Either you have significantly increased demand for these things by putting money into them. And I think that's the manipulation that you're talking about, right? Or you're dealing in an industry where there's a massive wealth effect. And that's traditionally the case with stocks and with housing.
Okay.
And the question is, well, why haven't we actually stepped in to intercede with this activity, especially in California, right?
What would it look like when you intercede? Like, are there places on the planet where they get involved with the pricing? Do communist countries manipulate this at a different level than we do?
I don't know. And this is where we're at. And maybe that's the question that I want to pose to you is why don't we intercede? Right? Is why don't we say, hey, look, we know this happens, right? We know that valuations of stock get completely out of whack, and we know why it happens. It's because people overinvest, and we don't care. We're okay with cycles, right? And the question is why? Why are we okay with that?
Yeah, I mean, and this is one of those things that even before monetary exchange happened, I would relate a economic recession very similar to a natural recession, right? Imagine if you're just a farmer and you get a famine, right, of some sort due to weather change or a plague of some sort. You get these periodic recessions. I've seen it likened to a snake shedding its skin. In order for it to grow, it has to peel off that old layer. Right. And it's kind of like that breakthrough that happens. Right. We saw this happen in the 90s, early 2000s with the tech boom, right? The tech.com boom, where all these things like, oh, technology and websites is the greatest thing. Let's dump all the money into it. And then all of a sudden it went kaput. But then from that, we did expand. And now we are at that next level of technology and .com.
And you touch on why I don't think they actually intercede, right? Because I think the theory, at least from a capitalist perspective, is buyer beware, right?
For sure.
Why should I, as the government, intercede when if the market is suggesting that there's this huge potential demand for them? Let people speculate. Allow people to go bankrupt. Allow people to overextend and to have these ridiculous valuations based on nothing, because out of it shall emerge something. Let the marketplace work itself out.
Yeah,
the laissez-faire economic approach to capital.
Right, unless you're too big to fail, right? The airlines are getting $25 billion bailouts right now. Meanwhile, more than half of the small businesses that are struggling aren't going to get theirs. So there's definitely a threshold of
which is crazy.
A certain size.
I'm actually so shocked right now. I'm reading now that they're running out of these the funds for the SBA.
Right.
For the SBA fund. I can't believe it. I mean, like this, in a matter of weeks, they've run out.
Well, it was nuts because we filled out for our own company within hours of the application being open. We completed our application. We had our paperwork ready to go. As soon as they opened it, it was done. And we didn't even get the call back. But, this is a side note, but that's because we banked at one of the big banks. And what we're hearing is some of the smaller banks were able to process it faster and get access to those funds with the SBA.
I have a friend of mine who did PayPal loans. He wouldn't even PayPal banking because he did a lot of e-commerce. and those guys he's already signed the loan paperwork. They've already told him that they legally are obligated to fund within 10 days. So,
Wow.
yeah, so he's in with PayPal finance, PayPal banking. You one of the last people you would expect. But getting back to this idea, the question then becomes, why do they allow these things to continue? And again, you have this idea of laissez-faire economic situations, but again, it gets back to this notion of when you're dealing with housing in particular, and housing is I'm always fascinated by housing because it's one of these things where it's a necessity of life, right? It's a necessity of life. And here you are out there creating bubbles in what would be, a fundamental thing that people need.
Sure.
And you're rendering that good unaffordable for a healthy chunk of the population. I mean, based on this idea of laissez-faire economics. And it simply makes no sense to apply what was a normal investor model to a good that is so fundamentally necessary for people to survive. And I think that's the paradigm that we're caught up here in Southern California. I mean, if you look at it, and we're getting into it entirely, but if you look at it, it's just 60% of homes in Southern California are owned by investors.
Right.
Investors.
So that's that spread that you get of home ownership versus renters. And it's
Right.
also that home ownership class versus renters. And then it's the next level of the investor landlord class, which aren't necessarily just homeowners either. I think there are potentially more devious forces that lie underneath this that do manipulate this and understand it and have that multi-generational wealth that know and ride these waves up and down and can play with it, right? As we discussed the other day, it's easy to take advantage of a bad market when you're cash heavy, right? But if you're like most Americans that don't have much cash, you can't take advantage of these natural waves or peaks and valleys of an economic cycle that happens, right? It goes up and down, but it's kind of like the ocean. Waves go up and down, but the sea level is pretty much always even, or in our case, slightly rising because it's heating.
Right.
But so it's kind of like our economy and or the housing market. On average, if you look over a long enough period, property values only appreciate about 2 to 3% a year on average. Which is, but in peak years, last year to this year, we've already appreciated 8 to 9% in San Diego alone. And if you look over the last several years, it's like 10% a year almost. It's a lot.
Right.
But then we hit a drop. And if you drop 20, 30, 40%, then it averages out again to the 2 to 3% a year.
Well, I think historicals for San Diego, for Southern California, are going to be close to 5-6%.
Sure,
actually.
absolutely, you're right. Over the last
historicals
60, 70
here
years,
over the time with peaks and valleys, 5-6%, which
that's because we're a desirable area and it was underpopulated. We're on the West Coast. People got here later than they did in the East Coast, right? And that's part of it. So it's filling it out, but now we're starting to get to that density.
Well, you have to, and again, this wealth effect has a lot of different triggers associated with it, right? And so, if a house if you're selling at $1,000 a square foot, guess what? You're going to attract a lot of people into that marketplace to build houses, right? And so again, California, which is I don't know, by my guess, I'd say 20% of people in this state are somehow real estate or real estate adjacent, right? I mean, so
True.
When you have housing prices that are high, you're going to have a lot of employment, which is going to drive your tax base, which is going to drive a lot of things. So we have a vested interest in keeping property values extraordinarily high. Unfortunately, that's going to change the dynamic of home ownership in this arena, right?
With the exception of the Fed, I feel like most public personas or elected officials or people that are representative of us always want to push for a growing economy, right? And they always try to delay any kind of recession. And we saw this last year, right? The inverse yield curve happened February 2019. And instead of raising rates like they should, the Fed was forced to keep the rates down low or even reduce rates, which kind of delayed the recession, right? We were trying to delay the inevitable, but now we've kind of combined. It was time for a recession based on how periodic these things are every 7 to 12, 13 years, on average 10 or 11 years.
There's also another economic theory that suggests that the average politician really doesn't care what happens after 4 years.
They don't care what happens after 2 years. They get reelected after two, right? Short of Congress, but for the most part,
Right.
like you spend half
Yeah.
your
I mean,
time
like
getting
they
reelected.
really only have a 4-year horizon, which is why we can't get rid of this debt, right? Like, because they don't have any vested interest in the long-term growth. They don't care about, our kids or our kids. They only care about reelection by design.
Right.
And so, like, we're almost, democracy by itself is doomed to fail because of the shortened time horizon, but especially with,
No, it just made me think of one of my other theories that I've got, but I'm just writing it down so I remember for the future.
right. No, but the idea of bubbles has always fascinated me because of this propensity that we allow it to happen. It just, rather than try and figure out a system that appropriately allocates resources, which is not that hard to do, by the way. I mean, we could tax second homes.
Right.
Like we could, we could do things to prevent, people from going so far out on margin for stocks. I mean, we could force the wealth effect into other areas of the economy. We could allow, we could go down this for a while, but it just seems to me
no, it is a lot to do with tax policy and stuff like that. And I think that's where the information asymmetry comes into play, right? The fact that it takes an extraordinary amount of effort to be able to understand how money works, understand how taxes work, understand how write-offs and things like that work. Because now I teach classes on how to build ADUs. And one of the segments of that class that I teach is how to do accelerated depreciation with cost segregation. And on your property that makes money, and a good rate of return, how you can show how you're losing money and offset your ordinary income that way, right? And this is what the investor landlord class does on a regular basis. But people that don't own property wouldn't know that tactic.
Right.
They don't teach you that in high school. They don't teach you that in college. They don't even teach you that when you're getting your real estate broker's degree, right? Or
Right.
So this is the kind of high level information asymmetry. It's not impossible to find, but you don't think about it, right? You only think about the major metrics when you're looking at houses, which is what's it cost to buy, what's my interest rate, and does it have green grass, right? I mean, so
Right.
it's basically all you're kind of looking at, and they're not giving you the information that what's this look like, how does this affect my overall financial plan for my long term and things like that. That's kind of and I think that's one of my other theories is that in a lot of societies, including ours, we willfully uneducate, or don't appropriately educate our citizens with the information they need to make proper financial decisions.
So do you think we do that on purpose to create a permanent underclass?
Correct. Because that the people that have the wealth are making sure they're telling their kids how this works, right? They're having these lessons starting in elementary school, middle school, how money works, right? I've already opened a savings account for all my kids for their college fund, but I've also opened bank accounts for them too, so they can start to understand the concept of money. So that they don't have to figure out like I did, which was after I was an adult, because even my own parents have had, kind of an old-fashioned, basic, linear understanding of money, and at a higher level, you understand money isn't that linear.
My favorite lesson from my dad was, he's like, it was Fat Ray, a guy from high school. He came out to one of my dad was in construction, and Fat Ray and I went to high school together, and Fat Ray was making $15 an hour driving after high school. After we graduated, he was driving a $40,000 Dodge Ram with the dualies on the back and all that. My dad comes to me and he goes, "These fucking Americans, man, they don't understand the value of saving. They just have no idea what it means to save and why it's important. They have $1, they spend $2."
Right, and you can't blame Fat Ray for that. He just wasn't taught properly.
Well, Fat Ray, the funny thing about this, I shared this story with some guys from the office, and they were like, "Well, I think your dad was discounting the impact that Fat Ray's truck might have on his personal life in Ortonville, Michigan."
Yeah, the externalities of having a nice truck.
And it dawned on me that Fat Ray had a very attractive girlfriend.
The truck helped with that, you think?
I think my dad was just discounting the impact on that, right? Like so.
But that's what they teach you, right? That's what the marketing teaches you, and that's what the advertising teaches you. Get this nice truck, you're gonna get that nice girl, right?
And apparently you are.
Yeah.
So,
So, but that's a different type of lesson than the more pragmatic lesson, which is
right.
how to actually manage your money, how to get an asset, maybe start an LLC or an S corp so you can lease that asset from it, do it as a write-off, write your miles off, whatever, So these are the tactics that they don't teach. So I think that with the recessions, I think with bubbles and stuff like that, it is a way to exploit the people that don't have the same level of information and savvy that the higher level people do, that understand it, right? Because when a recession happens, the smart people that have a little cash are saying, great, everything's on sale, right?
Right.
And then while they're riding it up, that's why, the people that I've been talking to, like, I'm going to stand on the fence until I see where this thing pans out and stay cash heavy, right?
Right.
Because they know they're not going to get access to credit, but if they have a couple bucks on them, they know they're going to start buying stuff on sale. And that's how these bubbles work again, right? So let people panic, and you do the opposite of the fishes, right? And so right now, most of the country are the fish that say everything's on fire, sell it, get rid of it, right? And this is what Warren Buffett will tell you, is to do the opposite of what the other investors are doing.
Right. No, there's contrarian investors. I mean, that's what they do. That's how the Kennedys made their wealth in the Great Depression, was shorting the market during the Great Depression.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that is what leads to generational wealth and power. I mean, so if you understand how these cycles work, I will tell you, some of it is, I mean, we both know some of this is having a nose for it, right? Like there's plenty of people that I know. I mean, my brother, dude can smell money. Like, it doesn't matter. Like, he can smell it.
But it was trained. He wasn't born with this gift. He figured it out and he practiced it and he kept
I
practicing.
tell you what, man, my ability
he was born
to
with it.
smell
He stole
money
your piggy
compared
bank.
to my brother. Like, I mean, he got his MBA. I went to law school. All right, like, so, like, I don't have it. My dad has it. We've got some cousins that have it. I'm okay at it, but I have to work I work hard for my money. So, I mean, he's definitely got the nose for it.
Well, so any last thoughts on this this economic bubble theory that you've got in terms of why it's happening, how it happens, and more importantly, what the results are? What's the implications? What's a takeaway that we can give to someone that's listening to this right now? Is that what could you do in this scenario?
Well, I think you have to acknowledge it for what it is, right? Like, and you have to understand that these bubbles are a natural part of certain economies, right? And if you see a lot of money going into someplace, think about where the source of that money is. Is it coming from the government? Is it coming from
A hedge fund?
particular
Yeah.
From a particular policy? Low interest
Okay.
rates is another good example, right? Is it
Right.
or is it coming from is it coming from this wealth effect? And so recognize the levers that somehow pull and push on these things. And when you remove one of those levers, is this something that's going to be removed and put back into place? Or is this something that's going to be gone for a longer period of time? Because the inverse is also true, right? If the wealth effect has inverted the demand curve, when the demand curve flips, they both go in the opposite direction at the same time. So, the valleys exist. And I think, especially my generation, like, we've been in a bull economy for 12 years, right? Like, I mean,
Yeah.
Basically, we're at 2000, since 2009. I think the trough was 2008, and it was very short-lived. And even this one, I mean, this was pretty scary with a 30% dip, but even at 30%, we were still sitting at maybe 3-year lows, I mean, in what was an 11-year bull economy. So it really wasn't much of a trough this time around.
Yeah.
So, not to scare the crap out of people, because I do think, I think things have changed, like, I think that this government poured $4 trillion into the economy at the drop of a hat. $4 trillion. I mean,
Right.
they didn't even think about it. It was a matter of a month.
It's future money, right? It's not now money. It's a loan against future debts, right? We're just gonna have to pay it back eventually somehow.
Well, a lot of these are loan guarantees, but just to give you an idea, $4 trillion, right? And this is just to have an idea of what that is. It's an astronomical sum of money. $4 trillion, the sum of all mortgage debt. And this is one of my favorite statistics. It's like the sum of all mortgage debt in this country commercial and residential, $16 trillion.
Right.
They poured a quarter of that into the economy in the last 2 weeks.
That's basically what our whole national debt is, right? I think our national debt's around 17 or 20 million. 20
I think
trillion.
it's closer to 22 now, but
22 trillion. Yeah. So, about a fifth of our national debt.
They just decided to do it, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I just think about if there's ways to, and this kind of triggers my next theory that is a whole nother thought process. We'll have to get into that later. I don't think these problems get solved by humans. I think the computers take over and solve the problems for us.
Yeah, not in our lifetime, son.
You don't think so?
No.
Ooh, okay. Well, we got a long life ahead of us, AJ. I'm sure we'll be around to see if it doesn't happen, because it's getting scary how tricky these computers are getting.
Yeah, no, I think I'll be happy if my computer can drive my car by the time I'm too old to drive.
Yeah, I think that happens sooner than you think. That's other theories of mine as well. AJ,
no.
I don't want to drag this on for too much longer. I think we got the main points out. There's a lot going on.
Cool.
I appreciate you joining me on the show. Thank you so much for watching another episode of I've Got a Theory. Here, my special guest, Ajay Gupta. Please like, comment, subscribe. I'd love to hear what viewers have to say. Thanks for joining me.
All right. Thanks, Henish.